The snow came down like broken glass. Caleb Grayson pulled his collar tighter against the wind cutting across the Wyoming plains, every gust sharp enough to skin a man if he let it. February 1887 had been the coldest winter anyone could remember, and Caleb had been riding through it alone for 3 hours now, checking fence lines that probably weren't even there anymore under 6 feet of white hell. His horse, a gray mare named Ash, snorted and shook ice from her mane. She didn't like this weather any more than he did. "I know, girl," Caleb muttered, his breath clouding in front of his face before the wind tore it apart. Almost done. That was a lie. They were maybe halfway through the western boundary, and the light was already starting to die. Caleb squinted against the snow, trying to make out landmarks that had become nothing but white shapes in a white world. The ranch was still a good 2 hours back, maybe 3 if this storm kept building. He was 41 years old, too old to be this stupid. But then again, stupidity had kept him alive this long. That, and the fact that after Mary died, he'd stopped caring much whether he woke up the next morning or not. 4 years of that. 4 years of working himself half to death during the day so he'd be too exhausted at night to remember what her laugh sounded like. 4 years of meals that tasted like dust and beds that felt too big, and mornings where the only reason he got up was because the cattle needed him. The frontier didn't care if you were grieving. It killed you just the same. Ash suddenly stopped, her ears flicking forward. Caleb froze. In country like this, when your horse stopped without being told, you listened. At first he didn't hear anything over the wind. Then it came again, a sound that didn't belong. Not quite human, not quite animal, just wrong. He turned Ash towards it, following the sound through the storm. The snow was coming down harder now, thick enough that he could barely see 10 feet ahead. His hand drifted to the rifle in his saddle holster, fingers numb inside his gloves. Then he saw it. Smoke. Not much. Just a thin gray thread rising through the white, barely visible against the darkening sky. But smoke meant fire, and fire meant people, and people out here in this weather meant trouble or death. Usually both. Caleb urged Ash forward, and the shape of a building began to emerge through the storm. Calling it a building was generous. It was more like a shack someone had thrown together from whatever scraps they could steal from better structures. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine, and half the walls looked ready to surrender to the next strong gust. The smoke was coming from a crooked chimney that seemed to be held together by prayer and rust. He should have kept riding. Anyone living in a place like this far from town, this deep into winter, they'd made their choices. The frontier didn't reward stupidity, and stopping to help strangers was a good way to end up dead or robbed. But Caleb's hand was already reaching for his rifle as he dismounted. The door hung loose on broken hinges. He could hear something inside now, low voices, the kind of quiet desperation that came right before the end. "Hello, the house," he called out, loud enough to be heard but not threatening. "Anyone in there?" Silence. Then, after a long moment, a woman's voice, thin and wary. "Stay back." "Ma'am, I'm not here to cause trouble. Name's Caleb Grayson. I've got a ranch about 7 miles east. Saw your smoke." "We don't need help." Caleb looked at the shack again, at the way the walls shuddered with each gust of wind, at the gaps between the boards where snow was already drifting through. The temperature was dropping fast. By midnight, this place would be a tomb. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but that's not true." Another long silence. Then, "If you're planning to rob us, there's nothing here worth taking." "I'm not planning to rob anyone." Caleb shifted his weight, trying to keep feeling in his feet. "But this storm's getting worse, and that roof's not going to hold much longer. You've got maybe 3 hours before this whole place comes down." He heard movement inside, shuffling, whispers. Then the door opened just enough for him to see a woman's face, pale and gaunt in the dying light. She was maybe 30, maybe younger, hard to tell. Hunger and cold had a way of aging people faster than time ever could. "Who are you?" she asked. "Told you, Caleb Grayson. I run cattle out east of here." Her eyes narrowed, studying him with the kind of wariness that came from experience. "You're the one they call the Ghost." Caleb flinched. He hated that name. It had started maybe 2 years after Mary died, when people in Pine Hollow noticed he'd stopped coming into town except for supplies, stopped talking to anyone unless he had to, stopped being anything except a shadow moving through his own life. The Ghost. Like he was already dead. and just hadn't figured it out yet. Some call me that, he said quietly. But I'm real enough, ma'am. And I'm telling you, you need to leave. Now. We can't. Why not? The woman's jaw tightened. Because we've got nowhere to go. Something in her voice caught him. Not the words, but the way she said them. The kind of empty certainty that came from having already tried every other option and found them all closed. May I come in? Caleb asked. She hesitated, then stepped back. It's not much. That was an understatement. The inside of the shack was worse than the outside. The fire in the makeshift hearth was barely alive, just a few struggling embers that weren't producing much heat. The floor was dirt, frozen hard as stone. There was almost no furniture, a broken chair, a table made from old crates, some threadbare blankets piled in the corner, and 2 children. A girl, maybe 12, sat on the blankets with her arms wrapped around a younger boy, maybe 7 or 8. They both looked at Caleb with the kind of empty exhaustion that made his chest tighten. The girl's lips were blue. The boy wasn't even shivering anymore, which was worse. Jesus, Caleb whispered. Don't, the woman said sharply. Don't pity us. He looked at her. Up close, he could see the toll this winter had taken. Her cheekbones too sharp, her hands raw and chapped, her dress worn so thin it might as well have been paper, but her eyes were fierce. Whatever had brought her to this place, she hadn't surrendered yet. How long have you been here? He asked. 2 months? Maybe 3. Lost track. Where's your husband? Something flickered across her face. Pain, anger, fear, all mixed together. Gone. Dead? Don't know. Disappeared last October. Haven't seen him since. Caleb glanced around the shack again, piecing it together. A family abandoned in the middle of nowhere. A woman trying to keep 2 children alive on nothing. A winter that didn't care how hard you fought. What's your name? Elena. Elena Whitaker. She nodded toward the children. That's Lucy and Ben. The names hit him like a punch to the gut. Lucy had been his mother's name. Ben had been what he and Mary had planned to name their son if the fever hadn't taken him before he'd even learned to cry. Mrs. Whitaker, Caleb said carefully, I need you to listen to me. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better. That roof, he gestured upward at the sagging beams, is going to collapse. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but it's coming down. And when it does, you and your children will freeze to death before anyone finds you. We don't have anywhere else. You can come with me. The words were out before he'd really thought them through. Elena stared at him like he'd just suggested they sprout wings and fly. What? My ranch. It's about 7 miles east. There's room, heat, food. He looked at the children again, at the way they clung to each other like they'd disappear if they let go. You'll be safe there. I don't know you. No, Caleb agreed. You don't. But you know this place is going to kill you. So the question is, do you want to die here or do you want to take a chance? Elena's hands were shaking, not from cold, from the weight of the decision. Caleb could see her mind working, turning over the options, trying to find a third path that didn't exist. Why? She finally asked. Why would you help us? Why? Caleb didn't have a good answer for that. He'd stopped helping people years ago. He'd stopped caring about anything except keeping his land and his cattle alive. He'd become the ghost because being dead inside was easier than feeling anything. But looking at those children, looking at the way the little boy had stopped shivering, looking at the empty desperation in Elena's eyes, he saw Mary. He saw the son who'd never drawn breath. He saw the way he'd failed them both because the storm had come too fast, and the doctor had been too far, and he'd been too useless to do anything except watch them slip away. Because I can, he said quietly. Elena's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden cost. Caleb just stood there and let her look. He'd learned a long time ago that the truth was easy to spot if you knew what to look for. No fancy words, no promises he couldn't keep, just what was real. After a long moment, Elena nodded. Okay. Okay? We'll go with you. The relief that crashed through him was unexpected and unwelcome. He pushed it down, focusing on the practical. How much can you carry? Not much. Most of what we had, we burned it to stay warm. Caleb looked around the shack again. They had almost nothing. A few blankets, Some empty tins that had once held food, a small cloth bag in the corner that probably held whatever clothes they had left. That's fine. Grab what you can. We need to move fast. Elena nodded and turned to the children. Lucy, Ben, we're leaving. Where are we going? Lucy's voice was so soft Caleb almost didn't hear it. Somewhere warm, Elena said. She was trying to sound confident, but Caleb could hear the tremor underneath. This man is going to help us. Ben looked up at Caleb with wide, suspicious eyes. Are you going to hurt Mama? The question knocked the air out of Caleb's lungs. How many men had these children seen? How many had promised help and delivered something worse? He crouched down to Ben's level, ignoring the way his knees protested. No, son. I'm not going to hurt anyone. I'm just going to take you somewhere safe. That's all. Ben studied him with the kind of serious intensity only children could manage. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded. Okay, getting them out of the shack and onto Ash was harder than Caleb expected. Lucy could barely stand, and Ben was so weak Elena had to carry him. Caleb ended up putting Ben in front of him on the saddle and helping Elena and Lucy walk alongside. It would slow them down, but there was no other choice. The storm hit them like a living thing the moment they left the shack. The wind had picked up, howling across the plains with enough force to knock Lucy sideways. Snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. Caleb could barely see Ash's head in front of him, let alone the route back to the ranch. Stay close, he shouted over the wind. Don't let go of the saddle. Elena nodded, her face already red and raw from the cold. Lucy clung to the saddle horn with both hands, her thin shoulders hunched against the wind. They started moving. It was 7 miles. 7 miles that felt like 70. The snow was already knee-deep in places, deeper where it had drifted. Ash struggled through it, breath steaming, muscles straining. Caleb kept one hand on Ben, making sure the boy didn't slide off, and used the other to guide the horse through the white hell that had swallowed the world. Time stopped meaning anything. There was just the next step, the next breath, the next moment of not dying. Lucy fell first. 1 second she was there, gripping the saddle, and the next she'd collapsed into the snow without a sound. Elena screamed, lunging toward her daughter, but the wind tore the sound away. Caleb pulled Ash to a stop and slid down, his boots sinking into snow that came up past his knees. Lucy! Elena was pulling her daughter up, slapping her face gently. Lucy, wake up! The girl's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and distant. Hypothermia. Caleb had seen it enough times to recognize the signs. We have to keep moving, he said. Can she ride? I don't know. We don't have time. Put her up front with Ben. Between the two of them, they managed to lift Lucy onto the saddle. She slumped against Ben, who wrapped his thin arms around his sister like he could hold her together through will alone. Can you walk? Caleb asked Elena. She nodded, but he could see the lie. She was exhausted, barely staying upright. The cold was winning. Hold on to the saddle, he ordered. Don't let go. They kept moving. The storm got worse, if that was possible. The wind shifted, driving the snow directly into their faces. Visibility dropped to nothing. Caleb was navigating purely by instinct now, by the feel of the land under his feet, by years of riding these plains until he knew them better than his own face. But even he was starting to doubt. The ranch should have been close by now, should have been visible through the storm. But there was nothing. Just endless white and wind and cold that ate through every layer until it found bone. Elena fell next. He heard the thud more than saw it, the sound of a body hitting frozen ground. Caleb spun around, pulling Ash to another stop. Elena was face down in the snow, not moving. Damn it! Caleb hissed. He grabbed her shoulders and rolled her over. Her face was pale, her lips blue. Mrs. Whitaker. Elena. Wake up. Nothing. He looked up at the children on the horse. They were both barely conscious, swaying in the saddle. If they stopped now, they'd all die. But if he left Elena in the snow to get the children to safety, she'd be dead before he could come back. There was no good choice. There was only the choice he could live with. Caleb hauled Elena up with a strength that came from somewhere beyond muscle. The kind of desperate strength that showed up when the alternative was watching someone die. He draped her across Ash's hindquarters, securing her with the lead rope. It wasn't comfortable, wasn't safe, but it would work. It had to work. Come on, girl, he whispered to Ash. Just a little farther. Puntista. The horse pushed forward, carrying a burden that should have broken her. But frontier horses were built different, built from the same stubborn refusal to quit that kept people alive out here. And then, through the storm, Caleb saw it. A light. Faint and distant, but there. The lantern he'd left burning in the ranch house window before he'd ridden out that morning. The one he'd been leaving burning every night for 4 years, ever since Mary died, because some part of him couldn't accept that no one was coming home to it. There, he breathed. Almost there. The last quarter mile was the hardest. The wind reached a crescendo, trying one last time to kill them all. But Caleb could see the house now, could see the barn, could see the fence line that marked the boundary between the frontier and something almost like safety. They crossed it together. A half-frozen man, a dying horse, 2 children who'd forgotten what warmth felt like, and a woman who'd been abandoned by everyone except a stranger who couldn't explain why he cared. The barn came first. Caleb got the door open and led Ash inside, out of the wind. The sudden absence of that howling noise was almost deafening. "Stay here," he told the children. "I'll be right back." He pulled Elena down from the horse, her body limp and cold. She was still breathing, but barely. Hypothermia had her now, and if he didn't get her warm fast, it would finish the job the storm had started. Caleb carried her across the yard to the house, kicking the door open with more force than necessary. The warmth inside hit him like a wall. The fire he'd banked before leaving was still alive, filling the room with heat that felt like a miracle. He laid Elena on the floor near the hearth and started working. Blankets first, piled on until she was covered. Then he built up the fire, feeding it until the room was almost too hot. His hands were shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from something else he didn't want to name. "Don't you dare die on me," he muttered, rubbing Elena's hands between his own, trying to force warmth back into her frozen fingers. Not after all that. Her eyes flickered open, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening as consciousness returned. "You're safe. You're at my ranch. The children are in the barn. I need to get them." Elena tried to sit up, but Caleb gently pushed her back down. "You stay here and warm up. I'll bring them." He was out the door before she could argue. The trip back to the barn took longer than it should have. His legs weren't working right anymore, and every step felt like lifting stones. But he made it. The children were still on the horse, huddled together in the darkness. "Come on," Caleb said, reaching up for Ben. "Let's get you inside." He carried Ben, and Lucy managed to walk with his support. Though she leaned on him so heavily, he was basically carrying her too. By the time they reached the house, his shoulders were screaming and his vision had started to narrow at the edges. But they were inside. They were warm. They were alive. Elena had managed to sit up, propped against the wall near the fire. Her color was better, her eyes clearer. When she saw her children, something broke in her face. Relief and grief mixed together in a way that made Caleb look away. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb didn't trust himself to respond. He just nodded and went to work on the children, stripping off their wet clothes, wrapping them in blankets, settling them as close to the fire as he dared. Ben fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted beyond endurance. Lucy lasted a little longer, her eyes tracking Caleb's movements with quiet wariness. "You're really the ghost?" she asked softly. "Just Caleb," he said. "The ghost is just something people say." "Why do they call you that?" He paused, not sure how to answer. "Because I've been alone a long time, and people out here, they start to forget you're real when you're alone long enough." Lucy thought about that. "We've been alone too. Does that make us ghosts?" The question hit harder than it should have. Caleb looked at this girl who'd spent the last month starving in a frozen shack, who'd learned that the world would let her die without caring, who'd probably stopped believing in help or hope or any of the things children were supposed to believe in. "No," he said quietly. "You're not ghosts. You're here. You're real. And you're going to be okay." He wasn't sure if that was a promise he could keep, but saying it felt like the right thing to do. Lucy's eyes drifted closed, and within moments she was asleep too. Caleb covered her with another blanket and then finally allowed himself to sink down onto the floor, his back against the wall. Every muscle in his body hurt. His hands were still numb despite the fire's heat. His clothes were soaked through with melted snow and sweat, and he knew he should change into something dry before the cold settled into his bones. But he couldn't move. Elena was watching him from across the room, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to do this, she said. Yes, I did. Why? There it was again. The same question she'd asked in the shack, and Caleb still didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to say it out loud. I lost my wife 4 years ago, he said finally. And my son. He was born early, didn't even make it through the first night. Mary died 3 days later from fever. He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Storm came in. Doctor couldn't get through. I sat there and watched them slip away, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with old grief. So when I saw your children, Caleb continued, his voice rough, I saw him. The son I never got to know. And I thought... He stopped, swallowed hard. I thought maybe if I could save them, it would, I don't know, matter somehow. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, it didn't. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. It sounded angry now, furious that they'd escaped. The wind hammered at the walls, screaming like something alive. But inside, the fire burned warm. The children slept peacefully, and for the first time in 4 years, Caleb's house felt like something more than just a place where a ghost waited to die. What happened to your husband? He asked. Elena's jaw tightened. He was a prospector, silver. Thought he'd found a rich vein up in the mountains, partnered with some men from Pine Hollow. Her voice went flat. Then one of them turned up dead, and the silver was gone. And Thomas, my husband, he disappeared. Some people said he killed his partner and ran with the silver. Others said he was murdered too, and someone just took his body where it wouldn't be found. What do you think? I think he was a fool who got in over his head. Elena's hands curled into fists. I think he trusted the wrong people. And I think whatever happened, I'll probably never know the truth. All I know is that one day I had a husband and a home and enough money to get through the winter. The next day, I had nothing except 2 children and a town that wouldn't look at me without whispering. They drove you out. Not officially, but yes. The bank took the house. People stopped talking to us. The children got teased, bullied, called thieves. Her voice cracked. So I took them and left. Found that shack near Dead Horse Creek. Thought we could make it through the winter alone. Thought... She trailed off. You almost didn't, Caleb said quietly. I know. Outside, the storm continued its assault. But inside, something had shifted. 2 strangers who'd been carrying their grief alone had, just for a moment, set it down together. You can stay here, Caleb said, until spring, until you figure out what comes next. I don't have money to pay you. I'm not asking for money. Elena studied him with those sharp, wary eyes. Then what are you asking for? Nothing. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the protest from his knees. Just stay alive. That's enough. He left her by the fire and went to change into dry clothes. In the small bedroom at the back of the house, the room he'd shared with Mary, the room he hadn't changed since she died, he pulled off his wet shirt and caught sight of himself in the dusty mirror. The ghost stared back at him, weathered face, gray in his hair that hadn't been there 4 years ago. Eyes that had forgotten how to see anything except the next task, the next day, the next empty season. But something was different now. He couldn't quite name it, a flicker of something. Not hope. He didn't believe in hope anymore, but maybe possibility. The sense that the story wasn't quite finished yet, even though he'd been sure it had ended the day he buried Mary. He pulled on a dry shirt and went back to the main room. Elena had gotten the children moved to the old sofa near the fire, both of them tucked under every blanket Caleb owned. She'd changed too. Into what? He wasn't sure. Something from her small bag, probably. It hung loose on her thin frame, but it was dry, and that was what mattered. Thank you, she said again, for all of this. I know we're just strangers. Burdens. You're not burdens. We will be, eventually. Elena looked at him steadily. I'm not stupid, Mr. Grayson. I know what people will say when they find out you took us in. The widow tied to theft and murder, her children, living under your roof. Her mouth twisted. The town already destroyed my reputation. I won't let them destroy yours too. Caleb thought about Pine Hollow. About the merchants who'd known him for 20 years, the ranchers who'd worked alongside him, the church folks who'd brought food after Mary died, and then slowly stopped coming when he made it clear he didn't want their pity. What would they say? What would they think? And then he thought about Ben's empty eyes in that frozen shack, Lucy's blue lips, Elena's desperate certainty that there was nowhere left to go. "Let them talk," he said. "I stopped caring what Pine Hollow thought a long time ago." That was a lie. He'd stopped caring about a lot of things, but not that. Not entirely. The town's opinion still mattered, even if he pretended it didn't. It mattered in the way merchants treated him, in the contracts he could get, in the slow erosion of respect that came when you stopped being part of the community. But looking at Elena, at the fierce gratitude in her eyes mixed with shame that she couldn't hide. He meant it, or he wanted to mean it, and maybe that was enough. The storm finally broke around midnight, the wind died down to something almost peaceful, and the snow stopped trying to bury the world. Caleb stood at the window looking out at the transformed landscape, everything soft and white and deadly quiet. Behind him, Elena and her children slept by the fire. Strangers who weren't strangers anymore. People who'd needed help, and he'd given it, and now they were here in his house changing something fundamental just by breathing. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know if this would work, if they'd survive the winter, if the town would forgive or forget or care at all. All he knew was that for the first time in 4 years, when he looked at that house, he didn't see a tomb. He saw people worth saving, and maybe, that included himself. Morning came too bright and too cold. Caleb woke on the floor near the fire, his back stiff and his neck complaining about the angle he'd slept at. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot that there were other people in the house, forgot that everything had changed in the span of one night. Then he heard it, the soft sound of someone moving in the kitchen. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. Elena was at the stove, trying to figure out how to work it. She had her back to him, her shoulders tense with concentration or maybe just uncertainty about whether she was allowed to be doing this at all. "Coffee's in the tin above the stove," Caleb said, his voice rough from sleep. Elena jumped, spinning around. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I just thought—" "It's fine." He pushed himself to his feet, joints popping. "You're doing me a favor. I usually don't eat breakfast until noon because I'm too lazy to cook it." That wasn't entirely true. Mostly, he just didn't see the point of cooking for one person. Easier to grab whatever was close and keep working. Elena relaxed slightly, turning back to the stove. "I'm not much of a cook anymore. We've been living on, well, not much. Anything hot will be better than what you've been eating." The children were still asleep on the sofa, tangled together under the blankets like puppies. Caleb added wood to the fire and then went outside to check on the animals. The storm had left everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, and the sky was that hard, bright blue that meant more cold was coming. Ash was in the barn, already fed. Elena must have done that before coming inside. The realization made something twist in Caleb's chest. She'd woken up in a stranger's house and immediately started trying to earn her keep. He spent an hour doing chores, checking fence lines close to the house, breaking ice in the water troughs. Normal work. The kind of mindless routine that had kept him sane for 4 years. But today it felt different. He kept thinking about the people inside the house, wondering if they needed anything, if they were okay, if he was supposed to be doing something other than what he was doing. When he came back inside, the smell of coffee hit him first. Real coffee, not the bitter burnt stuff he usually made. Elena had also managed to scramble some eggs and fry up salt pork. It wasn't fancy, but it was more than he'd bothered with in years. The children were awake now, sitting at the table with the careful stillness of kids who didn't know the rules yet. Ben's eyes tracked Caleb as he hung up his coat, wary and watchful. Lucy stared at her plate like she was waiting for permission to eat. "Go ahead," Caleb said, sitting down, "before it gets cold." Ben grabbed his fork immediately, shoveling food into his mouth like he expected it to disappear. Lucy was more careful, taking small bites, chewing slowly. Elena didn't eat at all, just watched her children with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "You need to eat too," he told her. "I'm fine." That wasn't a question. Elena's jaw tightened, but she picked up her fork. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of utensils and the crackle of the fire. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. Just Quiet. The kind of quiet that came from people too tired to pretend everything was normal. What happens now? Elena asked finally. Caleb looked up from his coffee. What do you mean? I mean, she gestured vaguely. We can't just stay here forever. You have a life, work. We're in the way. You're not in the way. We will be. She wasn't wrong. This arrangement couldn't last, not the way it was, with them sleeping by the fire and eating his food and existing in this strange limbo between guests and refugees. But Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been focused on getting them through the night. Everything after that was just after. Stay through the winter, he said. Spring comes, you'll have options. Right now, you don't. The town. Let me worry about the town. Elena studied him with those sharp eyes, trying to figure out what he wanted, what the catch was. Caleb understood that. She'd learned the hard way that help always came with a price. People didn't do things out of kindness. They did them for leverage, for power, for something they could use later. But he didn't know how to convince her he wasn't like that. Words were cheap, so he just met her gaze and let her look. After a moment, she nodded. Okay, through the winter, but I work for our keep. I'm not charity. Fair enough. That seemed to settle something between them. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The first week passed in a strange rhythm. Caleb worked the ranch during the day, while Elena tackled the house with an intensity that bordered on ferocious. She cleaned things that hadn't been cleaned in years, mended curtains he'd forgotten existed, organized the kitchen until it actually looked like a kitchen instead of a place where food went to die. Lucy helped her mother, quiet and careful, learning the space like she was memorizing an escape route. Ben followed Caleb everywhere, asking endless questions about the horses and the cattle and why the barn door squeaked and how old was Ash and did wolves really eat people, and on until Caleb's head hurt. But he answered every question, patiently, because something about the boy's desperate need to understand the world reminded him of himself at that age, before the frontier had taught him that some questions didn't have good answers. Pine Hollow noticed on the 8th day. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, other things the ranch had been running low on. He tied Ash outside Morrison's general store and headed inside, expecting the usual silent transaction. Morrison didn't talk much, which was one of the reasons Caleb liked him. But today was different. Morrison was behind the counter wiping down the surface with a rag. When Caleb walked in, the storekeeper looked up and his expression did something complicated. Surprise, curiosity, and something else Caleb couldn't quite identify. Caleb, Morrison said, heard you had visitors. Word traveled fast in small towns. Caleb should have expected this. Yeah, he said, keeping his voice neutral. Picked up a family during that storm last week. They needed help. That's so. Morrison set down the rag. Heard it was the Whitaker woman. And her kids. There it was. The name that carried weight. Caleb could see Morrison's mind working, putting pieces together, drawing conclusions. That's right, Caleb said. You know who she is? What people say about her husband. I know. Morrison's eyebrows went up. And you brought her to your ranch anyway. Seemed like the right thing to do. They were about to freeze to death. Might have been kinder. Girl's got a bad name, Caleb. Her husband killed a man over silver that didn't exist and disappeared into the mountains. People think she knows where he went, where the money went. Morrison leaned forward slightly. You sure you want that kind of trouble? Caleb picked up a sack of flour from the shelf, testing its weight. I'm sure I don't care much what people think. Maybe you should. Town's got a long memory. You start associating with folks tied to theft and murder, people start wondering about you too. Let them wonder. Morrison shook his head slowly. You always were stubborn. Even when Mary was alive, you dig your heels in over the damnedest things. But this, he gestured vaguely. This is different. This is the kind of thing that sticks to a man. Then it sticks. Caleb loaded supplies onto the counter. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, cornmeal. More than he usually bought, which Morrison noticed with a raised eyebrow but didn't comment on. The storekeeper tallied everything up, his mouth set in a thin line. That'll be $12, Morrison said. Caleb counted out the money and slid it across the counter. As he gathered his supplies, Morrison spoke again. Victor Hale was asking about you. Caleb paused. What about me? Wanted to know if you'd been in town lately. If you'd mentioned anything about... Guests. Morrison's expression had gone carefully blank. Told him I hadn't seen you in weeks. Victor Hale. The name alone was enough to make Caleb's jaw tighten. Hale owned half the valley. Land, cattle, mining operations, and enough political connections to make trouble for anyone who crossed him. He was wealthy, powerful, and mean in the way that came from never being told no. Why's Hale asking about me? Don't know. But you know how he is. Always got his fingers in something. Morrison hesitated. Be careful, Caleb. Hale's not a man you want interested in your business. Caleb loaded the last of the supplies into his saddlebags and headed for the door. Before he left, Morrison called out, For what it's worth. I think you did a decent thing, helping that family. The storekeeper's voice was quiet. Just hope it doesn't cost you more than you can afford. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than it should have. Caleb's mind kept turning over Morrison's words, over the mention of Victor Hale's interest, over the way the storekeeper had looked at him with something like pity. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe bringing Elena and her children to the ranch had been stupid, reckless, the kind of decision that would destroy everything he'd worked for. But when he rode up to the house and saw smoke rising from the chimney, saw Lucy playing in the snow near the porch while Ben threw snowballs at imaginary targets, saw Elena step outside with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders to see who was coming, he couldn't regret it. Not yet, anyway. How was town? Elena asked as he dismounted. Fine, got supplies. She studied his face. What happened? Nothing. You're a terrible liar. Caleb pulled the saddlebags down, not meeting her eyes. People are talking. About you being here. About your husband. Elena's expression went flat. I figured they would. Morrison said Victor Hale was asking about me. That got a reaction. Elena went pale, her hands tightening in the shawl. Hale? You know him? Thomas worked for him. Before everything. Elena's voice had gone thin. Hale financed the silver expedition. When it went wrong, when the partner died, Hale was the one who... She stopped, swallowed hard. He was the one who made sure everyone knew Thomas was responsible. Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut. Why? I don't know. Thomas never got a chance to defend himself. By the time people started asking questions, he was already gone. Elena looked at Caleb directly. If Hale's asking about you, it's not good. He doesn't ask questions unless he's planning something. What could he want with me? I don't know, but Caleb... She stepped closer, her voice urgent. Maybe I should leave. Take the children and go before this gets worse. I won't let you lose everything because you tried to help us. Where would you go? Elena opened her mouth, then closed it. Because there was no answer, no family to take them in, no money to start over somewhere else, no options except the same frozen death Caleb had saved them from. Then you stay, Caleb said firmly. We'll figure out Hale if he becomes a problem. And if he already is a problem? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. The next 2 weeks were harder. Word had spread through Pine Hollow faster than wildfire. The ghost had taken in the Whitaker woman. The thief's widow was living at Caleb Grayson's ranch. People were talking, speculating, creating stories that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with boredom and judgment. Caleb felt it every time he went into town. The way conversations stopped when he walked by. The way merchants suddenly got busy with other customers. The subtle shift from respect to suspicion that happened so gradually he almost didn't notice until it was too late. Morrison still served him, but the storekeeper had gotten quieter, more careful about what he said. The blacksmith claimed he was backed up with work and couldn't fix Caleb's broken plow until spring. The cattle broker who'd been buying Caleb's stock for 10 years suddenly said he had enough suppliers and didn't need more. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Not dramatic, not violent, just the slow, steady erosion of the life Caleb had built. Elena saw it too. She'd stopped going outside when Caleb was in the yard, stopped making herself visible, like she thought if people couldn't see her, they'd forget she existed. But it didn't work that way. Small towns had long memories and sharp teeth. It's getting worse, she said one night after the children had gone to bed. Caleb was sitting at the table working through the ranch accounts. The numbers weren't good. Without the cattle contracts, without the ability to get equipment repaired, the ranch was bleeding money faster than he could replace it. It'll pass, he said, not looking up. No, it won't. Elena sat down across from him, her voice steady. I know how this works. I lived through it once already. The town decided I was guilty, and nothing I said or did could change their minds. They're doing the same thing to you now, because of me. I made my choice. You made it without knowing what it would cost. Caleb set down his pencil and finally met her eyes. And if I'd known, if I'd ridden past that shack knowing exactly what would happen, would you have wanted me to leave you there? Elena didn't answer, because they both knew what she would have wanted didn't matter. She would have died for her children's sake, would have accepted that frozen death as the price of protecting them from whatever came next. I'm not a good man, Caleb said quietly. But I'm not the kind who lets children freeze to death because it's inconvenient to help them. So yeah, the town can talk, they can judge, they can make my life harder, but I'll still wake up tomorrow knowing I did the right thing. Even if it destroys you? Even then. Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not gratitude exactly. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that came from meeting someone who operated by the same broken compass you did. You're more stubborn than Thomas ever was, she said softly. That a compliment? I'm not sure yet. Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. The third week brought the first real threat. Caleb was out checking the northern fence line when he found it. 2 sections cut clean through. The wire curled back like someone had spent time making sure it was ruined properly. Not weather damage. Not accident. Deliberate. He stood there in the snow, looking at the cut wire, feeling anger build in his chest. Cattle could get out through gaps like this. Could wander off and freeze or get picked off by wolves. This wasn't just vandalism. This was someone trying to hurt him where it mattered most. He repaired the fence himself, working through the afternoon until his hands were raw and his back was screaming. When he got back to the house that evening, Elena took one look at his face and knew something had happened. What is it? Someone cut my fences. Her expression went carefully blank. How bad? Bad enough. Caleb washed his hands in the basin, watching the water turn pink from the cuts on his palms. Could have been kids. Could have been someone with a grudge. Could have been nothing. You don't believe that? No. Elena was quiet for a moment. This is because of me. You don't know that. Yes, I do. She turned away, arms wrapped around herself. It's starting again. The same thing that happened before. First the gossip, then the cold shoulder, then the threats. Next comes... She stopped, shook her head. We need to leave. No. Caleb, I said no. His voice came out harder than he meant it. Running doesn't fix anything. It just means they win. Sometimes letting them win is how you survive. Not this time. They stared at each other across the kitchen, 2 stubborn people refusing to back down. Finally, Elena looked away first. I don't want your protection if it kills you, she said quietly. Then it's a good thing that's not your choice to make. The words hung between them, sharp and final. Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Just walked away to check on the children, leaving Caleb alone with his anger and his determination and the growing certainty that the situation was going to get worse before it got better. Victor Hale showed up the next morning. Caleb saw him coming from half a mile away, a fancy carriage pulled by matched horses, too expensive and too clean for frontier roads. It pulled up in front of the house with unnecessary flourish, and Hale stepped down like he owned the place. He was a tall man, well-dressed in a way that made everyone around him feel shabby by comparison. Late 50s, silver hair combed back, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He looked like money and power, and the kind of confidence that came from never losing. Caleb Grayson, Hale said, extending his hand. Been meaning to stop by. Caleb didn't take the offered hand. Hale. If the snub bothered Hale, he didn't show it. Just let his hand drop and looked around the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone calculating value. Fine property you have here. Must be, what, 300 acres? Close enough. Been in your family long? Bought it myself 12 years ago. What do you want, Hale? The smile never faltered. Direct? I respect that. I'll be equally direct. I heard you've taken in some guests? The Whitaker family. That's my business. Ordinarily, I'd agree, but Elena Whitaker's husband owes me a substantial amount of money, and I've been trying to locate him for quite some time. From what I hear, he's dead. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, his family might know things. Where he went, what he did with certain assets that belonged to me. Hale's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes had gone cold. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Whitaker, privately. No. Excuse me? You heard me. She's got nothing to say to you. Hale's smile finally cracked, just a little. Mr. Grayson, I don't think you understand the situation. Thomas Whitaker stole from me a significant amount of silver ore and cash. His widow almost certainly knows where it is. And I'm telling you, she doesn't. You can't possibly know that. I know she was living in a shack with her children, burning furniture to stay warm and eating snow because they didn't have water. If she knew where stolen money was, she wouldn't have been dying in the middle of nowhere. Hale studied Caleb for a long moment. You're very protective of a woman you barely know. I protect people who need protecting. Novel concept, I know. Hale glanced toward the house, where Caleb knew Elena was watching from the window. Well, since you're being difficult, let me be clear. I want what Thomas Whitaker took from me. If his widow truly knows nothing, then that's unfortunate for her. But if I discover she's been hiding information, or if I find out you've been helping her conceal stolen property— He turned back to Caleb, the pleasant mask completely gone now. Then you and I are going to have a very different conversation. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I'm a patient man, Mr. Grayson, but my patience has limits. Hale started toward his carriage, then paused. One more thing. You might want to reconsider your association with the Whitakers. People in town are already talking. Contracts are being canceled. Business relationships are souring. It would be a shame if a respected rancher like yourself lost everything because he chose the wrong side. The only wrong side is the one you're on. Hale's laugh was cold. We'll see. He climbed into his carriage and left, the wheels cutting fresh tracks through the snow. Caleb stood there watching until the carriage disappeared over the ridge, his hands clenched into fists. Elena came out onto the porch, her face pale. He's going to destroy you, she said. He's going to try. Caleb, I need you to tell me the truth. He turned to face her. Do you know where your husband went? Do you know anything about the silver? Elena's eyes widened. You think I've been lying to you? I think I need to know what I'm fighting. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, slowly, her expression shifted from shock to something harder. I told you the truth. Thomas left one morning and never came back. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know anything about stolen silver, and if I did— Her voice broke slightly. If I did, do you really think I would have let my children starve rather than use it? The pain in her voice was real. Caleb could hear it, could see it in the way her hands were shaking. He felt like an ass for asking, but he needed to hear it directly. I'm sorry, he said. No, you're not. You needed to know. Elena wrapped her arms around herself. And now you do. So the question is, do you believe me? Caleb thought about the woman he'd found in that shack, about the way she'd fought to keep her children alive with nothing except stubbornness and will, about the fierce pride that kept her working every day to earn her keep even though she owed him nothing. Yeah, he said. I believe you. Elena nodded slowly. Then what do we do about Hale? Nothing. Yet. Let him make the next move. And if his next move destroys everything you have? Caleb looked at his ranch, at the house he'd built, the land he'd worked, the life that suddenly felt more fragile than he'd ever imagined. Then he looked at Elena, at the way she stood on his porch like she belonged there, like she was ready to fight alongside him even though she had every reason to run. Then at least I won't be the one who backed down, he said. It wasn't a good answer, but it was the only one he had. The attack started small. 3 days after Hale's visit, Caleb found another section of fence destroyed. A week later, someone left a dead coyote on his porch with its throat cut. The message was clear even without words. Elena stopped sleeping. Caleb would wake in the middle of the night to find her sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness like she was waiting for something terrible to come walking out of it. You need to rest, he told her one night. Can't. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Every time I close my eyes, I see Thomas. The morning he left. The way he kissed Lucy's forehead and told her he'd be back by supper. She turned to look at Caleb. I keep thinking, what if I'd stopped him? What if I'd made him stay? You can't think like that. Why not? It's true. If I'd stopped him, none of this would have happened. He'd be alive, or at least I'd know he was dead. The children wouldn't be targets. You wouldn't be losing everything because you tried to help us. Caleb sat down across from her, the floorboards creaking under his weight. My choices are mine. You don't get to carry them. That's not how it works. Sure it is. I could have ridden past that shack, could have let nature take its course, but I didn't, so whatever comes next, that's on me. Elena studied him in the dim light, her expression unreadable. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The next morning brought worse news. Ben had gone to the barn to help with the feeding, something he'd started doing every day without being asked. But when Caleb got there, he found the boy standing frozen in the doorway, his face white as snow. Ben? What's wrong? The boy didn't answer, just pointed. Caleb looked past him into the barn and felt his stomach drop. Someone had been inside. Feed sacks were slashed open, grain spilled across the floor, tools were scattered like they'd been thrown. And on the wall, written in something dark that Caleb really hoped was paint, were 2 words, leave now. Go back to the house, Caleb said quietly. But now, Ben. The boy ran. Caleb waited until he was gone before stepping into the barn, his hand on the rifle he'd started carrying everywhere. The destruction was worse up close. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone had spent time here, methodically ruining as much as they could. Ash was in her stall, unharmed but nervous. At least they'd left the animals alone. Small mercy. Caleb spent the morning cleaning up, sweeping grain that couldn't be saved, trying to salvage what he could. Elena came out to help despite his protests, and they worked in tense silence until Lucy appeared with lunch, bread and cheese and water that tasted like fear. Mama, I'm scared, Lucy said softly. Elena pulled her daughter close. I know, sweetheart. Are the bad men going to hurt us? No, I won't let that happen. But Mama, I said no. Elena's voice was fierce, absolute. Nobody is going to hurt you, not while I'm alive. Caleb watched them, mother and daughter, holding each other in a barn that smelled like violence, and something hardened in his chest. He'd been patient. He'd been reasonable. He'd tried to wait out the town's judgment and Hale's intimidation. But threatening children? That crossed a line he didn't even know he had. I'm going into Pine Hollow, he said. Elena looked up sharply. Why? Because this needs to end. Caleb, if you confront Hale directly, I'm not going to see Hale. Not yet, anyway. I'm going to see the sheriff. There are laws against this kind of thing. Time someone enforced them. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, a small building that always smelled like old coffee and older tobacco. Sheriff Tom Briggs was behind his desk when Caleb walked in, feet up, reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks out of date. Grayson, Briggs said without looking up. What brings you to town? Someone's been attacking my property, cut fences, destroyed my barn, left threatening messages. Now Briggs looked up. He was in his 50s, gray-bearded, with the kind of tired eyes that said he'd seen too much and cared about too little. That's so. That's so. I want it investigated. Any idea who might be doing it? I've got suspicions. Suspicions aren't evidence. Briggs set down his newspaper. Look, Caleb, I heard you took in the Whitaker woman. That true? What's that got to do with anything? Everything. You know the history there. You know what people think about her husband. Briggs leaned back in his chair. Maybe someone's trying to send you a message. Maybe you should listen. Caleb felt heat rise in his face. So you're saying I deserve this? Because I helped people? I'm saying actions have consequences. You chose to involve yourself with a situation that's complicated. People have strong feelings about it. People have strong feelings about a woman and her children nearly freezing to death. People have strong feelings about theft and murder. She didn't do either of those things. Her husband did, or might have. Doesn't matter. She's connected to it. And now you are too. Briggs picked up his newspaper again. My advice? Send her away. Let things cool down. Otherwise, he shrugged, can't guarantee your safety if folks decide to take matters into their own hands. Caleb stared at the sheriff, understanding settling over him like cold water. This wasn't incompetence. This was complicity. Briggs knew exactly who was behind the attacks and had decided not to do anything about it. Victor Hale, Caleb said quietly. Briggs's expression didn't change. Didn't say that. You didn't have to. Careful, Grayson. Hale's an important man in this valley. Makes accusations against him without proof. You'll find yourself in deeper trouble than you're already in. Caleb turned toward the door, then stopped. Tell me something, Briggs. When you took this job, did you actually care about protecting people? Or was it always about protecting whoever paid the most? Get out of my office. Gladly. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than it should have. Caleb's mind was racing, trying to figure out his next move. The law wasn't going to help. The town had already chosen sides, and Hale had enough power and money to make this nightmare last as long as he wanted. But there had to be something. Some way to fight back that didn't involve just taking hit after hit until there was nothing left to destroy. When he got home, Elena was in the barn, fixing Lucy's old rocking chair. It was a beaten-up thing they'd brought from the shack, held together mostly by hope and stubbornness. She'd been working on it for days, trying to make it stable enough for Lucy to actually use. How'd it go? She asked without looking up. Sheriff's useless, or bought. Probably both. Elena's hand stilled on the chair. So what now? I don't know. It was the first time he'd admitted that out loud. The first time he'd acknowledged that maybe he was in over his head, that maybe his stubborn determination wasn't enough to win this fight. Elena set down her tools and came over to where Caleb was standing. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the worry she tried to hide from the children. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past month. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For what? For all of this. For bringing this trouble to your door. For not leaving when I should have. Elena, no, let me finish. She took a breath. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to be honorable, to do the right thing, to prove that decency still matters out here. But Caleb, her voice cracked slightly. Sometimes decency gets you killed. So what? I should have left you to die instead? Maybe, if it meant you'd survive. They stared at each other, the barn quiet except for the sound of wind against wood. Outside, the children were playing in the snow, their laughter drifting through the walls like something from another world. I can't do that, Caleb said finally. I tried being that person. After Mary died, I tried just existing, going through the motions, not caring about anything except the next day. And it worked for a while. But it wasn't living. It was just a slower kind of dying. And this? What is this? I don't know. But it's not that. Elena reached out and touched his arm, her hand gentle. You're a good man, Caleb Grayson, even if you don't believe it. Before he could respond, she'd turned back to the rocking chair, dismissing the moment like it hadn't happened. But Caleb felt it lingering, the weight of words that meant more than either of them wanted to admit. That night, he couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Hale, about the sheriff, about the way this whole situation was spiraling beyond his control. Around midnight, he gave up and went to the barn to check on the animals. That's when he found it. He was moving the rocking chair Elena had been working on, planning to take it inside where it'd be safe from the cold, when he felt something strange in the seat. The fabric was loose, coming away from the frame. Curious, he pulled it back further. Papers fell out. Folded, yellowed, crammed into the space between the fabric and the wood like someone had hidden them there years ago and forgotten about them. Caleb's hands were shaking as he unfolded them. In the dim lantern light, he could make out neat handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, names. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. Then his blood went cold. These weren't just random papers. They were records. Financial records showing payments, transfers, land purchases. And at the top of nearly every page was one name, Victor Hale. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the other name that appeared throughout the documents, Thomas Whitaker. Except he wasn't listed as a thief or a criminal. He was listed as a witness, someone who'd seen transactions, signed documents, testified to agreements, and someone had annotated the papers in different ink in a shakier hand. Notes in the margins. Warnings. Evidence of fraud, of stolen land, of payments to officials who should have been impartial. Thomas Whitaker hadn't stolen from Victor Hale. He'd discovered Hale was stealing from everyone else. Caleb sat there in the barn, these papers spread across his lap, understanding blooming in his mind like poison. This was why Thomas had disappeared. This was why Hale had spread rumors about theft and murder. This was why Elena and her children had been abandoned, left to starve in the wilderness. Because Thomas Whitaker had known the truth, and Victor Hale couldn't let that truth survive. The barn door creaked open. Caleb looked up to find Elena standing there, wrapped in a shawl, her expression curious. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. Then she saw the papers. "What's that?" "Come here." She crossed the barn slowly, like she knew whatever this was would change everything. Caleb handed her the papers and watched her face as she read them, watched understanding and horror dawn in equal measure. "These were in the chair," Caleb said. "The one you brought from the shack. Your husband must have hidden them there." Elena's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the papers. "I don't understand. Thomas was... They said he stole from Hale, that he killed his partner. I think your husband discovered Hale was running a land fraud scheme, stealing property, forging deeds, bribing officials, and I think he tried to document it, tried to gather evidence." Caleb pointed to one of the pages. "Look at this. Hale purchased 6 ranches in the valley over the past 3 years, all at prices well below market value. But according to these notes, those sales were forced. The original owners were driven out through intimidation or fraud." "My house," Elena whispered. "After Thomas disappeared, the bank said we owed money we didn't owe. They took everything." "Because Hale wanted you gone. Wanted to make sure you couldn't ask questions, couldn't look for your husband, couldn't find..." He gestured at the papers. "This." Elena sank down onto a hay bale, her face pale. "He killed Thomas. Hale killed my husband to cover this up. Probably, or had it done. And the partner, the one they said Thomas murdered, was probably killed for the same reason, because he knew too much." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the barn walls. It sounded like something trying to get in. "What do we do?" Elena asked finally. "We take this to the authorities. Real authorities, not Sheriff Briggs. There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne. If we can get these papers to him, Hale won't let us get that far. The moment he finds out we have these, he'll kill us all." She wasn't wrong. Cheyenne was 3 days' ride in good weather. In winter, with Hale's men looking for them, they'd be lucky to make it past the valley border. "Then we don't tell anyone we have them," Caleb said. "We keep this quiet, figure out a plan." "For how long?" "Every day we wait is another day Hale could discover what we know." "I know, but..." A sound cut him off. Footsteps outside the barn, crunching through snow. Caleb grabbed the papers and shoved them under the hay, his hand going to the rifle leaning against the wall. The barn door swung open. Ben stood there in his nightshirt, rubbing his eyes. "Mr. Grayson?" "I had a nightmare. I couldn't find Mama." Elena let out a breath that was half relief, half something else. "I'm here, sweetheart. Come on, let's get you back to bed." She took Ben's hand and let him out, leaving Caleb alone with the hidden papers and the terrible knowledge they contained. He stood there in the cold barn, listening to the wind, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Finally, he retrieved the papers and folded them carefully, tucking them inside his coat. Tomorrow, he'd find a better hiding place. Tonight, they stayed with him. The next few days were the hardest Caleb could remember. He went through the motions of ranch work, but his mind was always elsewhere, turning over plans and discarding them just as quickly. Every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. They were trapped. Elena was just as bad. She jumped at shadows, watched the road constantly, couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes. The children noticed, grew quieter, more nervous. Lucy stopped painting. Ben stopped asking questions. The house that had slowly started feeling like a home became tense and brittle, like everyone was waiting for something to break. It broke on a Tuesday. Caleb was in the north pasture checking cattle when he heard the sound of horses. Multiple riders, moving fast. He grabbed his rifle and ran for higher ground, trying to get a better view. 5 men. Coming straight for the ranch. He recognized one of them, a foreman who worked for Hale, a mean bastard named Pike who'd been fired from half the ranches in the valley for roughing up workers. The others were similar types. Hired guns, men who solved problems with fists and bullets. Caleb ran. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he ran faster than he'd run in years, cutting through snow that came up to his knees, using old scout skills to take the shortest route back to the house. He burst through the door, breathing hard. "Elena, get the children. We need to go. Now!" She appeared from the kitchen, her face draining of color. "What's happening?" "Hale's men, 5 of them, maybe 3 minutes out." Elena didn't waste time asking questions. "Lucy, Ben, coats on right now!" The children scrambled, sensing the urgency. Caleb was already grabbing supplies, food, blankets, ammunition, the papers from their hiding spot in the floorboards. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Just move. They got out the back door just as the riders reached the front. Caleb could hear them shouting, demanding he come out, threatening what would happen if he didn't. But he was already pushing Elena and the children toward the tree line, toward the woods that would hide them if they could just make it that far. "Where are we going?" Ben asked, his voice small and scared. "Anywhere but here," Caleb said. They made it to the trees just as something exploded behind them. Caleb turned to see his barn engulfed in flames, smoke billowing into the winter sky. The riders had torched it, just burned it down like it was nothing. "Move," he hissed. "Keep moving." They stumbled through the forest, the snow making every step a battle. Behind them, Caleb could hear the riders spreading out, starting to search. They had maybe 5 minutes before they were found. "There," Elena pointed to a rocky outcropping. "We can hide there." They squeezed into a narrow space between boulders, barely big enough for all 4 of them. Caleb positioned himself at the opening, rifle ready, while Elena pulled the children close and tried to muffle their breathing. The riders passed within 20 feet. Caleb could hear them talking, could hear Pike's rough voice giving orders. "Check every tree, every rock. They're out here somewhere." "Maybe they went to town," another voice suggested. "On foot? In this snow?" "They're here. Keep looking." The voices faded gradually, moving deeper into the woods. But Caleb knew they'd be back, knew they'd search this area again, more carefully. "We can't stay here," he whispered. "We can't outrun them either," Elena whispered back. "Not with the children." She was right. Lucy and Ben were already exhausted, shivering despite the blankets. Running blindly through the forest would only get them caught. "Then we need to split up," Caleb said. "What?" "You take the children. Head east toward Miller Pass. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles that way. You can hole up there until it's safe. And you?" "I'll lead them west. Buy you time." Elena's eyes widened. "That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's the only chance the children have." "No, we stay together." "Elena, I said no." Her voice was fierce despite the whisper. "We've lost everything else. I won't lose you too." The words hit Caleb harder than they should have. He wanted to argue, wanted to point out the logic, the necessity, but looking at her face, at the absolute determination there, he knew she wouldn't bend. "Fine," he said. "Then we all go east. But we need to move now, while they're searching west." Getting out of their hiding spot felt like the longest moment of Caleb's life. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of fabric sounded impossibly loud. But somehow they managed it, slipping from rock to rock, using the trees for cover. The riders' voices faded behind them. They were searching farther out now, convinced their prey had run deeper into the forest. Good. Let them think that. It took 3 hours to cover 5 miles. 3 hours of stumbling through snow, carrying Ben when he couldn't walk anymore, supporting Lucy when her legs gave out. 3 hours of looking over his shoulder, listening for pursuit, expecting at any moment to hear shouting or gunshots. But they made it. The trapper's cabin was exactly where Caleb remembered it. A small, crude structure that had been abandoned for years. The roof was mostly intact, the walls solid enough to keep out the wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. They collapsed inside, too exhausted to even build a fire at first. Just lay there breathing, grateful to be alive, trying not to think about what came next. Finally, Caleb forced himself upright. "I'll get a fire going. We need heat." There was an old stove in the corner, rusty but functional. He coaxed it to life with kindling from his pack, feeding it carefully until warmth began to fill the small space. Elena got the children settled, wrapping them in every blanket they had. "We can't stay here long," Caleb said once the children were asleep. "They'll keep searching. Eventually they'll find this place." "How long do we have?" "Day, maybe 2. After that?" He shrugged. "We need to get these papers to someone who can use them. Someone Hale can't threaten or buy off." "The marshal in Cheyenne." "Yeah, but that's a 3-day ride, and we don't have horses anymore." "So we walk." Caleb looked at her. "Elena, that's insane. In winter, with children, with Hale's men hunting us. Do we have another choice?" "No, they didn't." "We leave tomorrow night," Caleb said. "Use the darkness to cover our tracks. Head for Cheyenne and pray we make it." Elena nodded, her face set with grim determination. Then, unexpectedly, she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you. For not giving up on us." "Wouldn't know how." She squeezed his hand once, then let go and went to lie down with the children. Caleb stayed by the fire, keeping watch, thinking about the impossible journey ahead of them. His ranch was gone. His life was gone. Everything he'd built over 12 years had been destroyed in the span of a few hours. But looking at Elena and her children sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, he couldn't regret it. Some things were worth losing everything for. He just hoped they'd live long enough to see it matter. They left the cabin at dusk the next day, moving through shadows that stretched long and cold across the snow. Ben rode on Caleb's shoulders, too tired to walk. Lucy held Elena's hand, stumbling but determined. Every few minutes, Caleb would stop and listen, searching the darkness for sounds that didn't belong. The first night was the worst. They made maybe 6 miles before exhaustion forced them to stop in a shallow ravine where the wind couldn't reach. No fire. Too dangerous. Just huddled together under blankets that weren't warm enough, trying to sleep while ice formed in their hair. "Tell me a story," Ben whispered through chattering teeth. Elena pulled him closer. "What kind of story?" "A happy one." Caleb felt something break in his chest. What happy stories were there out here? In a world where children froze and good people died and men like Victor Hale burned down barns because they could? "Once there was a boy," Elena began, her voice soft but steady, "who was braver than any knight. He didn't have a sword or armor, but he had something better. He had a sister who loved him and a mother who'd fight the whole world to keep him safe." "What about a father?" Lucy asked quietly. Elena hesitated. His father went away, but before he left, he made sure the boy knew something important, that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are." Ben was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you scared, Mama?" "Terrified." "But you're still going." "That's right." "Then I guess we're all brave." The simple logic of it made Caleb's throat tight. This 7-year-old boy, half frozen in a ravine, hunted by men who wanted him dead, still finding a way to see courage in survival. Morning came gray and merciless. Caleb's shoulder was screaming. He'd landed on it hard when the ice broke during a river crossing the night before. Elena had a cough that sounded worse with every hour. The children moved like ghosts, silent and mechanical. But they kept moving. By midday, they'd reached a ridge that overlooked the valley. Caleb could see smoke in the distance. Pine Hollow, probably, or maybe another ranch. Civilization felt impossibly far away despite being visible. "How much farther?" Lucy asked, her voice barely audible. "Still a long way," Caleb admitted, "but we're making progress." "Will those men find us?" "Not if I can help it." It was a lie. They all knew it was a lie, but sometimes lies were kindness. They descended the ridge carefully, using trees for cover, staying off trails where tracks would be obvious. Caleb's scout training was coming back, skills he'd learned 20 years ago when the frontier was even wilder than it was now. How to move without being seen. How to read terrain. How to disappear. He just hoped it would be enough. They were crossing an open meadow when Caleb heard it, the distant sound of horses. He froze, his hand shooting up to stop the others. "Down!" he hissed. "Get down! Now!" They dropped into the snow, pressing themselves flat. Caleb pulled his rifle around, scanning the tree line. There. Movement. 3 riders, maybe 400 yards out, moving parallel to their route. "Did they see us?" Elena breathed. Don't know. Stay still. The riders kept moving, disappearing behind a stand of pines. Caleb waited, counting his heartbeats, trying to decide if they'd been spotted or if this was just bad luck. Then the riders emerged again, closer this time. One of them was pointing in their direction. "Run," Caleb said. They ran. The meadow was wide and exposed, offering no cover. Caleb pushed the children ahead of him, his rifle ready, prepared to turn and fight if the riders got close enough. Behind him, he could hear shouting, the thunder of hooves gaining ground. They weren't going to make it to the trees. "Elena, take the children. Keep going." "Caleb, do it." She grabbed both kids and ran, half dragging them toward the forest. Caleb turned, dropping to one knee, bringing the rifle up. 3 riders, spread out, closing fast. Pike was in the lead, his face twisted with something like joy. Caleb fired. The shot went wide. His hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline. Pike didn't even flinch, just kept coming. Caleb worked the bolt, chambered another round, fired again. This time he hit something. One of the horses screamed and went down, throwing its rider into the snow. The other 2 riders veered off, circling wide, making themselves harder targets. Caleb ran. He crashed into the tree line just as another shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. The forest swallowed him, offering cover but also confusion. Where were Elena and the children? He couldn't hear them, couldn't see them through the dense pines. "Elena," he called, not caring any more about noise. "Where are you?" "Here." Her voice came from the left. Caleb changed direction, following it, his legs burning. He found them in a small depression, hidden behind a fallen log. Elena had the children behind her, a kitchen knife in her hand, the only weapon she had. "They're coming," Caleb gasped. "We need to move." "Ben can't," Elena said, her voice breaking. "He can't walk anymore." Caleb looked at the boy. Ben's face was flushed, his breathing shallow. Hypothermia, or maybe something worse. They'd pushed too hard, asked too much of a child's body that had already been through hell. Behind them, the sound of men crashing through undergrowth. "I'll carry him," Caleb said, slinging his rifle across his back and scooping Ben up. The boy was light, too light. "Lucy, stay close to your mother. We go fast and we don't stop." They moved through the forest like animals fleeing a fire, desperate and clumsy. Caleb's shoulder felt like it was tearing apart. His lungs couldn't get enough air, but he kept Ben's weight balanced, kept his feet moving, kept pushing toward something that felt less like hope and more like stubbornness. The riders were gaining. Caleb could hear Pike's voice, closer now, directing the search. "They can't have gone far. Spread out." The forest opened into another clearing, a frozen creek bed, ice thick enough to walk on but treacherous. Caleb started across without thinking, his boots finding purchase on the rough surface. Elena and Lucy followed. They were halfway across when the ice groaned. "Keep moving," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. The ice was shifting beneath them, responding to their weight, preparing to give way. "Caleb!" The ice broke. Not all at once. Just a section beneath Caleb's feet, spiderwebbing out in fractures that spread faster than he could react. He had time to thrust Ben toward Elena before the world tilted, and he was falling into black water so cold it stopped his heart. The shock of it drove every thought from his mind. Nothing existed except cold and darkness and the desperate need to breathe. He kicked, his boots dragging him down, his coat waterlogged and heavy. The current was stronger than he expected, pulling him under the ice, away from the hole he'd fallen through. Above him, through the distorted ice, he could see light, could hear muffled shouting, but he couldn't reach it. His lungs were screaming, his limbs were going numb. So this was how it ended. Drowned under ice while trying to save people who weren't even his family. Mary would have laughed at the irony. 4 years of not caring whether he lived or died, and now that he'd finally found something worth fighting for, the frontier was taking him anyway. His hand hit something solid. A branch or root caught beneath the ice. Caleb grabbed it, used it to pull himself along, following the current, hoping it would lead him to another opening. His vision was going dark at the edges. His body had stopped shivering, which meant he was past hypothermia and into something worse. But he kept pulling, kept moving, kept refusing to let go. The current pushed him against something, a rock or fallen log, he couldn't tell. But there was a gap where the ice hadn't formed completely, a small opening maybe 2 feet across. Caleb shoved his head through it, gasping, his lungs burning as air flooded back in. The world spun. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't feel most of his body, but he was breathing. That had to count for something. Someone was calling his name, Elena's voice, distant and desperate. He tried to answer, but his throat wouldn't work. Tried to pull himself out of the water, but his arms were too weak. Then hands grabbed him, multiple hands, hauling him up onto solid ice, dragging him away from the hole. He heard Elena's voice close now, choked with tears. "Stay with me. Caleb, stay with me." He wanted to tell her he was trying, wanted to say something reassuring or brave, but darkness was pulling at him, insistent and seductive, promising rest after so much struggle. "Don't you dare," Elena was saying, and she sounded angry now, fierce. "Don't you dare leave us. We need you. I need you." The words registered somewhere deep, finding purchase in a part of him that wasn't ready to quit yet. Caleb forced his eyes open, forced his lungs to keep working, forced himself to stay present in a body that wanted to shut down. "Cold," he managed to say. "I know. Lucy, help me get his coat off. We need to get him dry." They stripped him efficiently, Elena's hands shaking but determined. Someone, Lucy maybe, wrapped him in blankets. Someone else was building a fire, the sound of flint striking stone impossibly loud. "The riders," Caleb mumbled. "They'll see the smoke." "I don't care," Elena said. "You'll die without heat. You'll die if they find you. Then we'll die warm. Now stop talking and conserve your strength." The fire caught, grew, pushed back the cold. Caleb lay there shivering so hard his teeth rattled, wrapped in every blanket they had, while Elena rubbed his hands and feet trying to force circulation back into frozen flesh. "Is he going to be okay?" Lucy asked, her voice small. "Yes," Elena said with absolute certainty. "He's too stubborn to die." Ben was lying next to Caleb, also wrapped in blankets, his face pale. The boy had stopped shivering too, which Caleb's fuzzy brain recognized as dangerous. They'd pushed him too far, asked his small body to endure more than it could handle. "Ben needs help," Caleb said, forcing the words out. "More than I do." Elena looked at her son, and something broke in her face. "I know. There's a ranch, maybe 3 miles south, the Hendersons. Good people. They'll help." "We can't go 3 miles, not with both of you like this." "You have to. Ben won't make it otherwise." The truth of it hung between them, heavy and horrible. They'd fled into the wilderness to save the children, but the wilderness didn't care about their intentions. It just killed, efficiently, mercilessly, without judgment. "I'll go," Lucy said suddenly. Elena turned to her daughter. "What?" "I'll go to the ranch. I can run fast. I'll bring help." "Lucy, no. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than staying here? More dangerous than watching Ben die." Lucy's voice was steady, older than her 12 years. "I can do this, Mama. I'm strong enough." Caleb looked at this girl who'd been starving in a frozen shack a month ago, who'd learned that the world would let her die without caring, who'd somehow found the courage to keep fighting anyway. "Take the rifle," he said. "I don't know how to shoot." "Don't need to. Just carry it. Anyone sees a girl with a gun, they'll think twice before bothering you." Caleb tried to sit up and failed. "Tell the Hendersons Caleb Grayson sent you. Tell them we need help, fast. They'll come." "Lucy," Elena started. "Mama, we don't have time to argue." Lucy was already on her feet, already reaching for the rifle. "I'll be back. I promise." She kissed her mother's cheek, touched Ben's forehead gently, then looked at Caleb. "Don't die while I'm gone." "Wouldn't dream of it." Then she was running, disappearing into the forest, a small figure carrying a gun almost as big as she was. Caleb watched her go, feeling something twist in his chest that might have been pride or might have been terror. Elena sat down heavily beside him, her face in her hands. She wasn't crying, just sitting there like all the strength had drained out of her at once. "She's braver than I ever was," Elena said quietly. "She learned it from you." "No, I was ready to give up. In that shack, before you found us, I'd already decided. 1 more night, maybe 2, and then it would just be over. No more struggling, no more watching my children suffer." She looked up at Caleb. "You saved us. Not just our lives. You saved us from giving up." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. Saving people was supposed to feel heroic, significant, but mostly it just felt exhausting. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and Ben's labored breathing. The fever was getting worse. The boy's forehead was hot to the touch despite the freezing air. "Tell me about your wife," Elena said suddenly. "Why?" "Because I need to think about something other than whether my daughter is going to make it to that ranch alive. So tell me, what was she like?" Caleb thought about Mary. It had been so long since he'd tried to put her into words. "She was kind," he said finally. "Not in the easy way where people are nice when it costs nothing. She was kind when it was hard, when it hurt. When being kind meant she'd suffer for it." He paused. "After I came back from a bad scouting run, saw some things no one should see, I couldn't talk for 2 weeks. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't do anything except sit and stare. She never pushed, never demanded I explain, just sat with me until I could find words again." "You loved her, more than I knew how to say." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Thomas was different. I loved him, but it was complicated. He had these big dreams that never quite worked out. Always one more scheme, one more opportunity that would fix everything. And she shrugged. "I just wanted stability, a home, safety for the children. We fought about it, a lot. Toward the end, we were fighting more than we were talking." "That why you think he ran, instead of being killed?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he's alive somewhere, that maybe he really did find that silver and decided starting over was easier than coming back. But the other part," her voice cracked, "the other part knows he'd never abandon Lucy and Ben. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't his choice." The fire was dying down. Caleb wanted to add wood, but his arms still weren't working right. Elena did it instead, carefully feeding the flames. "If we survive this," she said, "what happens after?" "What do you mean?" "I mean us. The children. You've lost everything because of us. Your ranch, your reputation, nearly your life. What do we do with that?" Caleb thought about it. His ranch was ashes. His cattle were probably scattered or dead. The life he'd built over 12 years was gone, destroyed by a man who'd never faced consequences for anything. "We make sure Hale pays," Caleb said. "We get those papers to Cheyenne. We tell the truth. We make sure what he did matters. And after that? I don't know. Haven't thought that far ahead. That's not like you." "Maybe the old me. But the old me would have ridden past that shack." Caleb looked at Elena, at the firelight catching in her hair, at the exhaustion and determination written across her face. "I'm figuring out who this version is as I go." She almost smiled at that. Time crawled. Ben's fever spiked, then broke, then spiked again. Caleb's shivering gradually eased, sensation returning to his extremities in waves of excruciating pins and needles. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening. Lucy had been gone 3 hours. Then 4. "She should be back by now," Elena said, her voice tight. "Could have gotten lost. Or maybe the Hendersons weren't home. Or maybe—" "Don't." But they were both thinking it. Pike and his men were still out there. If they'd found Lucy alone in the forest. Another hour passed. The sun was setting, the temperature dropping fast. Soon they'd need to make a decision, stay here and hope Lucy returned, or try to move with Ben in his current state. Then Caleb heard it. Horses. Multiple horses, moving fast. He grabbed the rifle with hands that barely worked, bringing it up, prepared to make whatever stand he could in his current condition. The horses burst into the clearing, 4 riders, moving in formation. But the lead rider wasn't Pike. It was Jack Henderson, rifle across his saddle, his weathered face grim. Behind him were 2 of his ranch hands and Lucy riding behind one of them, her face flushed with triumph. "Heard you folks needed some help," Henderson said. The relief that crashed through Caleb was so intense it left him dizzy. Elena was already running toward her daughter, pulling Lucy down from the horse, holding her like she'd never let go. Henderson dismounted and surveyed the scene, the dying fire, Ben's fevered form, Caleb wrapped in blankets and barely functional. He didn't waste time with questions. "Murphy, get that boy on your horse. Sarah, help Grayson. We move fast. There's men hunting these folks, and I don't aim to be here when they arrive." They moved fast. Henderson's ranch hands were efficient, getting everyone mounted and moving within minutes. Caleb ended up behind Henderson, barely able to hold on, his head swimming. But they were moving. They were alive, and they were finally heading toward something that felt like hope. Henderson's ranch appeared through the dusk like salvation. A solid house, warm lights in the windows, the smell of cooking food. Henderson's wife, Margaret, met them at the door, took one look at Ben's fevered face and Caleb's half-frozen state, and started barking orders. Within an hour, Ben was in a warm bed with poultices on his chest, being fed broth by Margaret. Caleb was in dry clothes with bandages on his frostbitten fingers. Elena and Lucy were fed, warmed, safe. Henderson sat Caleb down in his study, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and waited. "So," he said finally, "Lucy told me some things. About Victor Hale, about documents, about men burning your ranch." He took a drink. "That all true?" "Every word." "You got proof of Hale's involvement?" Caleb pulled the papers from inside his shirt, still damp but readable. He handed them to Henderson, watched the rancher's expression change as he read. "Sweet, merciful..." Henderson looked up. "This is land fraud, bribery, probably murder if Thomas Whitaker really is dead. That's why we're running. Need to get these to Cheyenne, to someone who can use them. Hale's got half the valley in his pocket. Sheriff won't help you. Most of the town council either works for him or owes him money." Henderson set down the papers. "But he doesn't own everyone." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been watching Hale steal from good people for 5 years. Watching him destroy families, ruin lives, and no one could prove anything. But this..." He tapped the papers. "This is proof, real proof. And I'm not letting it die in these mountains. You don't have to risk..." "Like hell I don't. My brother lost his ranch to Hale 3 years back, bank foreclosed over debts that appeared out of nowhere. Frank drank himself to death 6 months later." Henderson's jaw was set. "So yeah, I'm helping. Question is, what's the plan?" Caleb's exhausted mind tried to form strategy. "Get to Cheyenne, find the federal marshal, give him the papers and testimony. Hale's men will be watching every road. You won't make it 10 miles. "Then what do you suggest?" Henderson thought for a moment. "There's a cattle drive scheduled to leave for Cheyenne in 4 days. 20 men, 100 head, safety in numbers. Hale won't attack that many people. 4 days is a long time. Hale could find us. My ranch is defensible, and I've got friends, ranchers who've been wanting a reason to stand up to Hale. You stay here. I'll put the word out. By tomorrow night, we'll have enough men to make Hale think twice about trying anything." It was risky. Staying in one place made them targets, but trying to run in their current condition would get them killed just as surely. "Okay," Caleb said. 4 days. Then we ride for Cheyenne." Henderson nodded and stood. "Get some rest. You look like hell." Caleb didn't argue. He found Elena in the room where Ben was sleeping, sitting beside her son's bed, holding his small hand. The boy's breathing was easier now, his color better. "He's going to be okay," Elena said without looking up. "Margaret says the fever will break by morning." Caleb sat down heavily in the other chair. Every muscle in his body hurt. "Henderson's helping us. We've got 4 days to rest. Then we ride to Cheyenne with a cattle drive." 4 days. Elena finally looked at him. "Do you think we'll make it?" "Yeah, I do." "Why?" "Because we've made it this far, and we've got something Hale doesn't." "What's that?" "People who give a damn." Caleb leaned back, closing his eyes. "He's got money and power and fear. But we've got people willing to risk everything because it's right. That has to count for something." Elena reached over and took his hand. Her grip was warm, solid, real. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up." "Same to you." They sat there in silence, watching Ben sleep, listening to the sounds of a house full of people who'd decided that standing against evil was worth whatever it cost. And for the first time since the whole nightmare began, Caleb let himself believe they might actually survive this. Outside, the Wyoming winter howled, but inside, surrounded by friends and fire and something that felt like family, the cold couldn't quite reach them anymore. The next morning, ranchers started arriving. First came old Tom Bridger with his 2 sons, rifles across their saddles and determination in their eyes. Then the Walsh family, all 4 brothers who'd lost half their land to Hale's schemes 3 years back. By afternoon, 12 men had gathered at Henderson's ranch, and more were coming. Caleb watched them arrive from the porch, his bandaged hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. These weren't gunfighters or mercenaries. They were farmers and cattlemen, men who'd spent their lives avoiding trouble because trouble out here usually meant death. But they'd come anyway. "Word travels fast when it's the right word," Henderson said, joining him on the porch. "People have been waiting for someone to stand up to Hale. You gave them a reason."
Or got them all killed. Maybe. But at least they'll die fighting instead of watching everything they love get stolen piece by piece. Henderson lit his pipe. "That's worth something." Inside, Elena was helping Margaret prepare food for the gathering crowd. Caleb watched her through the window, moving with quiet efficiency, and felt something tighten in his chest. A month ago, she'd been dying in a frozen shack. Now she was here, alive, fighting back. The transformation wasn't miraculous. It was just human stubbornness refusing to quit. Ben appeared beside Caleb, his fever broken, but his face still pale. "Are those men here to help us?" "Yeah, they are." "Why?" "They don't know us." It was a fair question. Caleb thought about how to answer it. Because sometimes people get tired of letting bad things happen. Sometimes they decide that standing together is better than falling apart alone. Ben considered this with the seriousness only children could manage. "Mr. Grayson, when this is over, where will we go?" "Don't know yet, son." "Can we stay with you?"
The question hit harder than it should have. Caleb looked down at this boy who'd lost everything, who'd nearly died more times than anyone should count, who still somehow had enough hope left to imagine a future. "We'll figure something out," Caleb said, because that was all the truth he had to offer. That night, Henderson gathered everyone in his barn. 23 men stood in a rough circle, their faces lit by lantern light, waiting to hear what they'd risk their lives to be part of. Caleb stood in the center, the documents laid out on a barrel in front of him. His hand still hurt, his shoulder throbbed, and exhaustion pulled at him like an anchor. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Most of you know who I am. Some of you know what happened to my ranch. All of you know Victor Hale." He gestured to the papers. "What you don't know is that Hale's been running a land fraud operation for at least 5 years. Forged deeds, bribed officials, forced sales through manufactured debts. He's stolen property from at least 20 families that I can document, probably more." The men shifted, murmuring. Tom Bridger stepped forward. "You got proof of this?" Caleb picked up one of the documents. Thomas Whitaker documented everything before he disappeared. Financial records, forged signatures, payments to county officials. "It's all here." "Where'd you get these papers?" "Hidden in furniture that belonged to Whitaker's family. His wife didn't even know they existed until we found them by accident." Another voice from the back. "Why should we believe the wife of a thief?" Elena stepped forward before Caleb could respond. She'd been standing in the shadows, but now she moved into the light, her chin up, her voice clear. "Because my husband wasn't a thief. He was murdered for trying to expose Hale. And I've spent the last 4 months watching my children starve because everyone in Pine Hollow decided I was guilty by association." Her eyes swept the gathered men. "Some of you were there. Some of you watched it happen. And none of you did anything." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, heavy with collective guilt. "You're right," Tom Bridger said finally. "We didn't. We were scared. Hale's got power, money, connections. Standing up to him felt like suicide." He looked at Caleb. "But you did it anyway. You lost everything, and you're still standing. That's worth something." "Question is," Walsh spoke up, "what do we do now? We can't fight Hale directly. He's got too many men." "We don't fight him," Caleb said. "We expose him. These documents go to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Once the law knows what Hale's been doing, once it's public, he can't hide behind bribes and threats anymore. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for justice that might never come, we protect each other. We make sure Hale can't pick us off one by one. We show him that fear only works when people stand alone." Henderson cleared his throat. "The cattle drive leaves day after tomorrow. 20 head, enough men to make it a hard target. Caleb, Elena, and her children ride with us to Cheyenne. The rest of you, you hold your ground. You watch each other's backs. And you don't let Hale think he's won." The men looked at each other, weighing the risk, calculating what it would cost. Then one by one, they nodded. It wasn't courage. Not really. It was just exhaustion with being afraid. The next day brought trouble in the form of Pike and 6 riders. They came at noon, bold as brass, riding straight up to Henderson's property like they owned it. Henderson met them at the property line, rifle in hand, with Tom Bridger and his sons flanking him. "That's far enough," Henderson called out. Pike pulled his horse to a stop, his scarred face splitting into a grin. "Henderson, heard you've been harboring fugitives." "Heard wrong. Don't think so. Victor Hale's looking for a woman and her kids, and the man who's been helping them. Word is they're here." "Your word's not worth much." Pike's grin faded. "You're making a mistake. Hale's offering good money for information. Could make your financial troubles disappear." "Don't have financial troubles." "Not yet. But things change fast out here. Fences get cut, cattle disappear. Sometimes whole barns burn down." Pike leaned forward in his saddle. "Be a shame if something happened to this nice ranch of yours." Henderson didn't flinch. "You threatening me?" "Just stating facts. Here's a fact freeze. You're on my property without permission. I count 6 of you. I count 23 of us." Henderson gestured behind him, where armed men had emerged from the barn and house. "So unless you want to test those odds, I suggest you ride out the way you came." Pike's eyes narrowed, calculating. He'd expected intimidation to work, expected Henderson to fold like everyone else had folded when Hale's men came calling. The fact that it hadn't seemed to genuinely surprise him. "You're making an enemy you can't afford," Pike said. "Already got enemies. What's one more?" For a long moment, Pike just stared. Then he pulled his horse around. "Hale's going to remember this." "Good. Tell him Jack Henderson's done being afraid." The riders left, but the tension didn't ease. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. Hale wouldn't back down from a direct challenge. He'd escalate, and when he did, people would die. That night, Caleb found Elena sitting outside, wrapped in a borrowed coat, staring at the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Keep thinking about tomorrow, about everything that could go wrong." Caleb sat down beside her. "Want me to lie and say it'll be fine?" "No, I've had enough lies." She turned to look at him. "What happens if we don't make it? If Hale stops us before we reach Cheyenne? Then someone else finishes it. Henderson, Bridger, someone. The papers exist now. The truth exists. Hale can't kill it even if he kills us." "That's supposed to be comforting?" "Little bit." Elena almost laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "I keep thinking about Thomas, about how he must have felt when he realized what Hale was doing, how scared he must have been. And I wasn't there. I was home with the children, complaining about money, and he was out there trying to do something good. And Her voice broke. "I never told him I was proud of him. Never said it mattered." Caleb reached over and took her hand. "He knew." "You can't know that." "Yeah, I can, because he hid those papers where you'd find them, in Lucy's chair, something you'd keep, something you'd save even if you lost everything else. He was making sure that if something happened to him, you'd have what you needed to fight back." Caleb squeezed her hand. "That's not the action of a man who doubted his wife's strength." Elena was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "After this is over, if we survive, what happens to us?" "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know. A month ago, I just wanted to survive the winter. Then I wanted to keep my children safe. Now I want—" She trailed off, searching for words. "I want a life that isn't just survival. I want mornings that don't start with fear. I want my children to remember what happiness feels like." "That's not too much to want, isn't it? Out here, wanting anything more than survival feels greedy." Caleb thought about his own wants. Simple things that felt impossible. A home that wasn't ashes. Work that mattered. Someone to share breakfast with who understood that silence wasn't always empty. "Mary used to say the frontier makes you choose," he said quietly. "You can let it make you hard, or you can stay soft and let it break you. But there's a third option she never mentioned. You can stay soft in the ways that matter and hard in the ways that keep you alive." He looked at Elena. "You're doing that. You're still kind despite everything. Still fighting for your children despite knowing you might lose. That's not greedy. That's just human. Is that what you're doing? Staying soft where it matters?" Caleb considered it. A month ago, he would have said he'd gone completely hard, that 4 years of grief had calcified him into something that couldn't feel anymore. But then he'd found a family dying in the snow and couldn't walk away. Had risked everything for strangers. Had remembered what it felt like to care whether someone else survived. "Trying to," he said. Elena leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture simple and right. They sat there watching stars wheel across the Wyoming sky. Two people who'd survived too much finding comfort in the fact that they hadn't survived alone. The cattle drive assembled at dawn. 20 men on horseback, 100 head of cattle, and 4 people who carried the weight of truth in their saddlebags. Ben rode with Henderson. Lucy was behind one of the Walsh brothers. Elena and Caleb rode side by side, rifles ready, eyes scanning for threats. They moved out slowly, the cattle setting the pace. It would take 3 days to reach Cheyenne at this speed. 3 days exposed on open trail, vulnerable to attack at any moment. The first day passed without incident. They made camp that night in a box canyon, natural walls on 3 sides, easy to defend. The men took turns on watch while others slept. Caleb took the midnight shift, walking the perimeter, checking shadows. He was completing his circuit when he heard it, the soft sound of someone moving through darkness. His hand went to his rifle. "It's just me," Lucy said, emerging from behind a wagon. Caleb relaxed. "Can't sleep?"
Kept having nightmares. She came closer, hugging herself against the cold. "About the ice. About you falling through. I made it out." "Barely." Lucy looked up at him, her young face serious. "Why'd you do it? Risk everything for us?" "Your mother asked me the same thing." "What'd you tell her?" "That I had to. That walking away wasn't something I could live with." Caleb crouched down to Lucy's level. "You want the real answer?" "Yes. When I found you in that shack, I saw my son, the one I lost, and I thought, maybe I can't save him, but I can save you. Maybe that'll balance the scales somehow." He paused. "Doesn't work that way, though. Can't trade one life for another. Can't make up for losing someone by saving someone else. But it still matters. You still matter." Lucy was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm glad you found us. Even with everything that happened, I'm glad." "Me too, kid." She surprised him by hugging him, quick and fierce, before pulling away and running back to where her mother slept. Caleb stood there in the darkness, feeling the ghost of that embrace, and understood something he'd been too stubborn to see before. This wasn't about redemption, wasn't about making up for Mary and the son he'd never known. This was just about showing up when people needed help and refusing to walk away. Sometimes that was enough. The attack came on the second day. They were crossing open country, nowhere to hide, when riders appeared on the ridge above them. Caleb counted 15, maybe 20, too many to fight directly. The cattle drive pulled into a defensive circle, rifles out, prepared for whatever came next. Pike rode down first, alone, hands visible and empty. He stopped 30 yards out. "Caleb Grayson," he called. "Victor Hale wants to talk." "Not interested." "You should be. He's offering terms. You hand over those papers and everyone walks away. No one else has to die. And if we refuse, then we take them. And anyone who gets in the way bleeds." Henderson rode up beside Caleb. "He's bluffing. Attacking this many armed men would be suicide." "Maybe. Or maybe Hale's desperate enough not to care." Elena moved her horse closer. "Let me talk to him." "Elena, no. He wants the papers. He wants me. Let me negotiate." "Absolutely not." "Caleb, we can't fight 20 men and protect the children. Let me try to end this without more killing." Before Caleb could argue further, Elena had ridden forward, pulling her horse to a stop between the two groups. Pike watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "didn't expect to see you taking charge. Tell Hale I'll give him the papers. On one condition." Pike's eyebrows rose. "What condition?" "He confesses, in front of witnesses, admits what he did to Thomas, to all the families he destroyed. Then he can have the documents and we all go our separate ways." Pike actually laughed. "You think Hale's going to confess?" "I think he wants these papers more than anything. I think he's scared of what happens if they reach Cheyenne. And I think he'll agree to almost anything to get them back." Elena's voice was steady. "So you ride back and tell him my terms. He confesses publicly, or these papers go to the federal marshal and everyone knows what kind of man he really is. He'll never agree. Then we've got nothing to talk about." Elena turned her horse and rode back, calm and controlled, like she'd just negotiated a cattle price instead of her life. The men in the drive were staring at her with something like awe. Pike watched her go, then turned his horse and headed back to the ridge. "What just happened?" Henderson asked.
She bought us time, Caleb said, and put Hale in a position where he has to respond. You think he'll actually confess?
No.
But I think he'll want to meet. Want to see those papers, confirm they're real. And when he does, Caleb pulled out his rifle and checked the load. We'll be ready. The response came within an hour. A rider approached under a white flag delivering a message. Hale would meet at sunset, halfway between the two groups, with 3 men each, to talk. It's a trap, Tom Bridger said flatly. Of course it's a trap. Caleb folded the message. But it's also an opportunity. We meet him, record his confession, if we can get one, and ride away. If he tries anything, our men are close enough to provide cover. And if he just shoots you the moment you're in range, then you make sure these papers get to Cheyenne anyway. Elena stepped forward. I'm coming with you. Like hell. They're my husband's documents, my family's fight. I'm not sitting here while you risk your life for it. They argued for 20 minutes, but in the end, Caleb knew he'd lost. Elena had the same stubborn determination he did, the kind that didn't bend even when bending made sense. Sunset came too fast. Caleb, Elena, and Henderson rode out to the meeting point, a flat stretch of ground between the two groups. Victor Hale was already there with Pike and another hired gun, sitting on his horse like he was posing for a portrait. Caleb Grayson, Hale said as they approached, you've caused me considerable trouble. Good. And Mrs. Whitaker, I'm surprised you're still alive. The frontier isn't kind to women alone. I'm not alone, Elena said coldly. Hale's smile was thin. No, I suppose you're not. Well then, you wanted to negotiate. Here I am. What are your terms? You confess to everything. The land fraud, the murders, the bribes. You do it in front of witnesses. Then you can have the papers. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, these papers go to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, they'll hang you for murder. Hale studied her for a long moment. You're very brave, Mrs. Whitaker, or very foolish. I'm not sure which. I'm tired. That's what I am. Tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Tired of men like you getting away with destroying lives because you can. Elena's voice shook slightly but didn't break. So yes or no? Do you confess or do these papers get delivered? May I see them first? Confirm they're what you claim? Elena looked at Caleb, who nodded slowly. She pulled the documents from her saddlebag and held them up, close enough for Hale to see, but not close enough to grab. Hale's expression changed as he recognized his own handwriting, his own signatures. For the first time, fear flickered across his face. Where did you find these? Does it matter? Thomas hid them. The little worm actually managed to document everything. Hale's laugh was bitter. I underestimated him, thought he was too weak to be a threat. He was stronger than you'll ever be, Elena said quietly. Strong enough to die for it, just like you're about to be. The gunshot cracked across the prairie before anyone could react. But it didn't come from Hale's men. It came from behind them, from the ridge where the cattle drive had circled. And it wasn't aimed at Caleb or Elena, it was aimed at Pike, who fell from his horse with a bullet in his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Hale's men drew weapons. Henderson and Caleb returned fire. Elena's horse panicked, rearing up. Caleb grabbed her reins, trying to control the animal, while simultaneously returning fire. Go! Henderson shouted. Get her out of here! Caleb didn't argue. He pulled Elena's horse around and spurred both animals into a gallop, bullets kicking up dirt around them. Behind them, Henderson laid down covering fire, his rifle barking rhythmically. They made it back to the cattle drive, both horses lathered and wild-eyed. The men had formed a defensive line, rifles ready. Tom Bridger was reloading, his face grim. That didn't go well, he said. Could have gone worse. Caleb dismounted, helping Elena down. She was shaking, but unhurt. At least we got him talking. He admitted to killing Thomas, to the fraud. You all heard it. Hearing's not proof. No, but it's something. Caleb looked at the ridge where Hale's men were regrouping. They're going to charge. We need to be ready. The men took positions, spreading out along the defensive line. Lucy and Ben were hidden in one of the wagons, protected by layers of supplies and armed guards. Everything that could be done had been done. Now it was just a matter of whether they'd survive the next hour. Hale's men charged at full dark, using the confusion of twilight to mask their approach. But the cattle drive was ready. Rifle fire erupted from multiple positions, controlled and devastating. 2 riders went down immediately. A third's horse was shot out from under him. The attackers broke off, retreating to regroup. They'd expected an easy target, panicked defenders, maybe a few scattered shots. What they'd gotten was organized resistance from men who'd spent their lives shooting game and predators with the same cold efficiency. "They won't try that again," Henderson said, reloading. "Next time they'll be smarter." "Or they'll give up," Tom Bridger suggested. "We've already bloodied them. Might decide it's not worth it." As if in answer, a new sound echoed across the prairie. More horses, coming fast. Caleb's heart sank. Reinforcements. Hale had brought more men, but when the riders crested the ridge, they weren't wearing Hale's colors. They were townspeople from Pine Hollow. Morrison, the shopkeeper, was in the lead, rifle across his saddle. Behind him were farmers, ranchers, even the blacksmith who'd refused to repair Caleb's equipment. 20 more men, maybe 30, all armed and riding hard toward the confrontation. They positioned themselves between Hale's forces and the cattle drive, effectively cutting off any attack route. Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Victor Hale, by order of the territorial governor, you're under arrest for land fraud, bribery, and murder." Silence fell across the prairie. Then Hale's voice, smaller now, almost defeated. "On whose authority?" "Mine." A new rider emerged from the townspeople, a man in a marshal's uniform, badge gleaming even in the dying light. He rode forward slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Marshal William Cross, Territorial Authority. I've been investigating reports of corruption in this valley for 6 months. When word reached me that documentation existed, I came immediately." He looked at Hale directly. "You're finished." What happened next was almost anticlimactic. Hale's men, seeing they were outnumbered and facing actual legal authority, surrendered without additional shots fired. Pike was taken into custody along with the others. Hale himself was handcuffed and loaded into a wagon, his face gray with shock and defeat. It was over. Just like that, after all the violence and fear and desperate running, it was simply over. Elena stood beside Caleb, watching the marshal's men secure the prisoners. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Is it really done?" she asked. "Yeah, it's done." "I can't believe it." Her voice was wondering, almost childlike. "After everything, we actually won." Marshal Cross approached them, his weathered face kind despite the authority he carried. "You must be Mrs. Whitaker and Mr. Grayson. I've heard a lot about both of you." "From who?" Caleb asked. "Your daughter," Cross said to Elena. "Lucy, I believe. She rode into Pine Hollow 3 days ago, walked straight into the telegraph office, and demanded to send a message to the territorial governor. Told the operator if he didn't help her, she'd tell everyone in town he was a coward." Cross smiled. The operator was so impressed he paid for the telegram himself. Elena looked around wildly. "Lucy? Where is she?" "Here, Mama." Lucy emerged from this crowd, dirty and exhausted but grinning. Behind her was Ben, being carried by Morrison, both children safe and whole. "I'm sorry I lied," Lucy said, "but I heard you and Mr. Grayson talking about how no one would help, about how the law was bought. And I thought, maybe the law here is broken, but there's bigger law. So I rode to town and found a telegraph and—" She shrugged. "I asked for help." Elena pulled her daughter into a crushing embrace, crying and laughing at the same time. Ben squirmed free from Morrison and joined the hug, the 3 of them holding each other like they'd never let go. Caleb stood back, watching, feeling something enormous and overwhelming build in his chest. This 12-year-old girl had done what none of the adults had thought to do. She'd gone over the local corruption and appealed to higher authority. She'd saved them all through sheer stubborn bravery. Cross came to stand beside him. "That's quite a family you've got there." "They're not," Caleb started, then stopped. Because that wasn't true anymore, was it? Somewhere along the way, through all the running and fighting and refusing to give up, they'd become exactly that. A family. Not by blood or marriage or any official declaration, just by choice. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "They are." The next 3 days were a blur of testimony and paperwork. Marshal Cross took statements from everyone, recorded every detail of Hale's operations. The documents Elena's husband had hidden proved invaluable. Concrete evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Hale would hang. Pike and his men would spend years in prison. The stolen land would be returned to its rightful owners. Justice, slow and bureaucratic but real, was finally coming to the valley. Caleb stood on Henderson's porch one evening, watching the sun set over land that looked the same but felt different somehow. Cleaner, like a poison had been drawn out. "What will you do now?" Henderson asked, joining him. "Don't know. Ranch is gone. Cattle scattered or dead. I'm basically starting over from nothing." "You could stay here. I could use a good hand. Someone who knows the land." It was a generous offer, a way forward that made sense. But Caleb found himself shaking his head. "Appreciate it, but I think I need to find my own way again. Figure out who I am now that I'm not the ghost anymore." Henderson nodded, understanding. "And Elena? The children?" Caleb had been avoiding that question, had been trying not to think about what happened after the immediate crisis ended, because thinking about it meant acknowledging how much he'd come to need their presence, how empty the world would feel if they went their separate ways. As if summoned by his thoughts, Elena appeared on the porch. She'd cleaned up, borrowed a dress from Margaret that actually fit. With her hair down and the constant fear gone from her face, she looked younger. Happy. "Ben wants to know if you'll teach him to rope cattle," she said. "Does he now?" "He's determined to be a rancher when he grows up. Says you're the best one he knows." Elena smiled. "I told him you'd probably say no because you're secretly scared of a 7-year-old with a rope. That's a vicious lie and you know it. Prove it then." Henderson cleared his throat. "I'll just leave you two alone." He disappeared inside with the subtlety of someone who'd been married for 30 years and knew when to make himself scarce. Elena came to stand beside Caleb, looking out at the same sunset. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only came from people who'd survived too much together to need constant words. "The marshal said we can have Thomas's life insurance," Elena said finally. "Not much, but enough to start over somewhere, maybe Denver. Lucy's always wanted to see a real city." "That sounds good." "Or," Elena hesitated, "or we could stay in the valley, buy land, build something that's ours." Caleb looked at her. "That what you want?" "I don't know. A month ago, I wanted to leave this place and never look back. But now," she gestured at the landscape, "now I think about all the people who helped us, who stood up to Hale even when it was dangerous. And I think, maybe this place isn't all bad. Maybe it's worth staying and making it better." "That's a lot of work." "I'm not afraid of work." "What about me?" The question came out before Caleb could stop it. "What happens with us?" Elena turned to face him fully. "What do you want to happen?" "I want..." Caleb struggled to find the words. "I want mornings where I wake up and you're there. I want to teach Ben to rope cattle and help Lucy with whatever wild scheme she comes up with next. I want to build something with you that isn't just survival. I want..." He stopped, overwhelmed. "You want a family," Elena said softly. "Yeah. But I don't want to assume. Don't want to push you into something you're not ready for. You just got free. You deserve time to figure out who you are without someone else defining it." Elena reached up and touched his face gently. "Caleb Grayson, for a smart man, you can be remarkably dense." "What?" "I've been in love with you since you carried Ben through that blizzard. Since you refused to abandon us even when it cost you everything. Since you showed my daughter what a good man looks like." Her eyes were bright with tears. "So yes, I want a family with you if you'll have us." Caleb kissed her. It wasn't smooth or perfect. Their noses bumped and they both laughed nervously. But it was real and right and felt like coming home after being lost for years. Behind them, they heard cheering. Caleb turned to find Ben and Lucy watching from the window, both grinning like they'd just won a bet. Henderson and Margaret were there too, along with half the ranch hands who'd apparently been watching the whole thing. "About time," Ben yelled. "I told Lucy you were sweet on Mama, but she said you were too stubborn." "I did not," Lucy protested. "I said you were both too stubborn to admit it." Caleb found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. Elena was laughing too, her hand in his, their children watching with joy instead of fear. This wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd ridden out into that blizzard. Wasn't the life he'd thought he was living? But maybe that was the point. Life didn't care about your plans or expectations. It just kept happening, kept throwing challenges and choices at you, and the only thing that mattered was what you did with them. He'd chosen to help a dying family. That choice had cost him everything and given him more than he'd known he needed. 3 months later, Caleb stood in front of a half-built house on land he'd purchased with the settlement money the territorial government had given him for his destroyed ranch. It wasn't much yet, just a frame and a roof, walls that still needed finishing. But it was theirs. Elena was inside, arguing with the carpenter about window placement. Lucy was painting wildflowers on the porch posts, her artistic impulses finding new outlets. Ben was in the yard with Morrison's son, practicing with a rope on a patient fence post. The valley had changed. Families who'd lost land were getting it back. Hale's trial had exposed a network of corruption that was slowly being rooted out. Sheriff Briggs had resigned in disgrace. New people were moving in, good people, who wanted to build something honest. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard winters ahead, still struggles with weather and money and all the thousand challenges of frontier life. But the difference was they were facing it together. Not alone. Not afraid. Henderson rode up, his horse laden with supplies. Brought lumber like you asked. Also, Margaret sent food. Says you're both too skinny and need feeding. Tell her thanks? Henderson dismounted, studying the house. Coming along nice. Should be done by winter. That's the plan. You happy, Caleb? It was a simple question that deserved an honest answer. Caleb thought about everything he'd lost. His first wife, his son, his ranch, 4 years of his life spent as a ghost. Then he thought about what he'd found. Elena, Lucy, Ben, a reason to wake up that went beyond mere survival. Yeah, he said. I am. Good. You earned it. That night, after the children were asleep in Henderson's house where they were staying until their own was finished, Caleb and Elena sat outside under the stars. The same stars that had watched them struggle through blizzards and gunfights and fear. But those struggles felt distant now, like stories about other people. Do you think Thomas would approve? Elena asked suddenly. Of us? Of this? Caleb considered it. I think he'd want you happy, want his children safe and loved. The rest, he shrugged. The rest is just details. I still miss him sometimes. Is that wrong? No, you can love someone new without erasing someone old. Doesn't work that way. Elena leaned against his shoulder. You're wiser than you look. That's a low bar. She laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie. In the distance, a coyote howled. Once, that sound had meant loneliness. Now it was just part of the landscape, neither good nor bad, just present. The wedding happened on a Sunday in May, when the valley was green and the worst of winter was a fading memory. They held it at the new house, even though it wasn't quite finished. Half the valley showed up, ranchers who'd stood with them, townspeople who'd helped. Even Marshall Cross rode in from Cheyenne. Lucy stood beside her mother, holding wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Ben stood with Caleb, wearing a too large jacket and trying to look grown up. Henderson officiated, reading from a book that wasn't quite legal, but felt right. Do you, Caleb Grayson, take this woman to be your wife? To stand with her through whatever comes? To be father to her children and partner in building whatever life you can carve from this stubborn land? I do. And do you, Elena Whitaker, take this man to be your husband? To trust him with your heart and your children's future? To build alongside him whatever home you can make from hope and hard work? I do. Then by the authority vested in me by common sense and basic decency, I declare you married. Kiss her before she changes her mind. Caleb kissed Elena while the valley cheered. Ben made exaggerated gagging noises. Lucy threw flowers. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, not threatening, just reminding them that the frontier was still the frontier, that struggle wasn't over just because one battle was won, but they'd survived worse than storms. They'd survived isolation and fear, and men who thought power gave them the right to destroy lives. They'd survived by choosing each other when the world said they should choose safety, by standing together when standing alone would have been easier. The reception was simple, food and music and dancing in the yard of a half-finished house. Caleb found himself standing on the porch at sunset, watching his new family celebrate with friends who'd become something more than neighbors. They'd become proof that communities could be built on courage instead of fear, on helping instead of hoarding, on showing up when people needed you, even when the cost was high. Ben ran up to him, breathless and excited. Mr. Grayson, Papa, can we get a dog? Morrison's got puppies, and he said maybe. Papa, Caleb repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign and right at the same time. Yeah, son, we can get a dog. Ben whooped and ran off to tell his sister. Caleb watched him go. This boy who'd been half dead in a frozen shack now running wild with joy and felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe. Or just the absence of the constant ache that had lived there since Mary died. Elena appeared beside him, her wedding dress already grass-stained and rumpled. Our son wants a dog. I know, I said yes. Without asking me? But she was smiling. Figured you'd agree. You're soft when it comes to those kids. Look who's talking. You taught Ben to rope yesterday and let him use your good rope. The one you said was too expensive for learning. That's different. How? It just is. Elena laughed and kissed him, quick and sweet. We're going to be okay, aren't we? All of us. It wasn't really a question, but Caleb answered anyway. Yeah, we are. Because that was the truth that mattered most. Not that life would be easy, or that struggles were over, or that the frontier would suddenly become gentle. But that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And together was always stronger than alone. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched empires rise and fall, had seen civilizations flourish and fade. They didn't care about human struggles or triumphs. They just existed, constant and indifferent. But under those stars, on a piece of Wyoming land that had witnessed too much pain, 4 people who'd been strangers were now family. Not through blood or convenience, but through choice. Through showing up when it mattered and refusing to walk away when walking away would have been easier. And maybe that was the real story of the frontier. Not the violence or hardship everyone talked about, but the quiet moments when people chose connection over isolation. When they decided that building something together was worth more than protecting what they had alone. Caleb Grayson had been called the ghost for years. Had lived like someone already dead, going through motions without meaning, surviving without living. But that man was gone now, buried somewhere in the snow alongside his old life and old grief. What remained was just Caleb, a man with a family, a future, a home that was still being built but already felt complete. As the celebration continued around him, as his wife laughed with neighbors and his children played in the twilight, Caleb allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would be perfect, but the earned kind that came from surviving hell and discovering that life on the other side was still worth living. That sometimes the things we lose make room for things we didn't know we needed. That second chances existed if you were brave enough to reach for them. The Wyoming wind picked up, carrying the scent of spring grass and distant rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, crops to plant, house to finish, children to raise, a marriage to build into something lasting. There would be setbacks and struggles and days when survival felt harder than giving up. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was music and laughter and family and the simple miracle of being alive and choosing to stay that way. And in the end, what more could anyone ask from life on the frontier than that?